All right, guys, so today we're reacting to a video called How Dana White Built the UFC into a $10 billion empire. $10 billion.
That's a lot of money.
That's wild.
That's 10 billion. So I actually started watching the UFC way in the beginning. I love that shit. That's actually what got me like big time into doing jiu-jitsu. So I did karate all throughout, you know, when I was young, all through my teens and 20s. But yeah, jiu-jitsu I got into mainly because I watched the UFC. I'm like, what the fuck are these guys doing on the ground and what's happening? So yeah, over 11 years ago now, I started jiu-jitsu and I've been doing it ever since. And I'm a big fan. I love watching all the fights.
Yeah, so for people that don't know, you're a brown belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu,
yeah.
But you also had a couple of fights, like MMA fights. We actually put up some clips so they could see some of your highlights.
I've had 6 fights.
That's crazy. Now, you watched UFC early on, but like how much did you know about like the business behind UFC or like its progression?
Not much. I know that like in the beginning it wasn't making crap. They didn't pay fighters much. They still don't pay fighters much for what they probably deserve. But yeah, I know that it was sold from Fertitta Brothers to, you know, whatever, 10, I don't know how many years ago, but I remember that being like a huge purchase, and I know that it's grown ever since. So yeah, I'm sure it's a, you know, I knew it was a big number.
All right, cool. So yeah, you do know a decent amount. All right, cool. Let's watch it.
The UFC has quickly become one of the world's most valuable sports organizations. The company now brings in more than $1 billion in annual revenue. They signed a 5-year broadcast deal with ESPN in 2018, worth $1.5 billion. And after being acquired by Endeavor and going public last year, the business is now worth about $10 billion. But this success didn't happen overnight. In fact, it almost didn't happen at all. When Dana White and Franklin Lorenzo Fertitta acquired the UFC in 2001, the business was on the verge of bankruptcy. They paid $2 million for the entire operation, but MMA still wasn't recognized as a sanctioned sport, and they received nothing more than a trademark for the UFC name.
So that sounds like a fucking horrible deal, doesn't it? Like you would never buy anything like that.
So here's the thing. It sounds like a bad deal, but the reason why it's not as bad of a deal is because in the scheme of things, $2 million for a potential of having some new cool thing that could blow up. But more than that, the people that bought it, that took it over and ran it, they had to have been really passionate about the sport. So if you have a little bit extra money and you're passionate about something, it's not that big of a deal to gamble, because they're probably like, you know what, what's the worst case? We lose $2 million or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It probably wasn't that much money to them, I'm assuming, at the time to gamble on something like that. But yeah, as a strict business, you know, decision to do it and think that you could grow it, it's a little bit risky. But knowing that there's a big upside potentially, maybe, and that you're passionate about that sport, being passionate just makes anything, you know, worse, makes sense for someone to do.
I guess the one question that I had, because like I don't remember the year it said, I probably wasn't born yet, but the thing that I was confused by was like, was UFC even like a household name at the time? Like, did it hold any value? Because if it didn't, that's what they paid for.
When they bought it, it had no value at all. There was no name. Like no one really knew what the UFC was. And I remember people saying when it first started, like, oh, you could fight in a cage. And so people knew it as cage fighting, not UFC.
Right.
And we were like, what the hell can you do? People didn't even know the rules, you know? But as people watched it, it just got, you know, it grew.
UFC go from a business on the verge of bankruptcy with no commercial appeal to a $10 billion juggernaut today. This is the story of how Dana White built the UFC into a $10 billion empire. To really understand the UFC story, we need to go all the way back to the early 1990s. There was a salesman named Art Davie who took boxing classes as a child and eventually became obsessed with figuring out who the world's best fighter was. One day he came across an article in Playboy magazine about a Brazilian jiu-jitsu school in Los Angeles that was run by Rorion Gracie. The idea was pretty simple. The Gracie family had essentially invented Brazilian jiu-jitsu and were frequently beating people 2 to 3 times their size in Brazil. So they came to America to showcase the effectiveness of the system and started beating martial artists from all backgrounds that visited their gym. This intrigued Art Davie, so he approached Rorion Gracie with an idea: a single elimination, one night, no rules combat tournament. This meant karate would face off against jiu-jitsu and boxing against judo. But more importantly, the tournament would determine the world's best fighter. So the two men agreed on a partnership and set off to organize the event. But there was just one problem. No one wanted the TV rights. Boxing promoters and executives at HBO, Showtime, ESPN, and many other networks thought this was a terrible idea and didn't want to assume the risk, given it was an unsanctioned sport. But still, Art Davie and Rorion Gracie kept calling around, and eventually they convinced a new upstart company called Semaphore Entertainment Group to air the event.
So I didn't know about any of this yet. Like I knew like the purpose, that they wanted to see what was the best martial art, but I didn't know like it started where They went to Gracie and they're like, let's do it, and nobody wanted it. I knew nobody wanted it because it was unsanctioned, meaning that it wasn't even legal in most states.
It was like taboo.
Yeah, it was like. Yeah, it was like, you would think of something that, wow, you're doing something illegal, you're crazy. So I remember all that. But yeah, so it's definitely stuff I'm learning right now.
They then raised $200,000 from Rorion's students to fund the tournament and decided to host the event in Colorado because the state didn't have a boxing commission, which meant less regulation, less red tape, and fewer legal hurdles. The only rules were no eye gouging and no biting. But there was no time limit, and the referee couldn't stop the fight unless there was a knockout, submission, a fighter tap, or the corner throws in the towel. It was about as ruthless as you could get.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
There was no time limit?
I knew that. I remember this. And because they were saying, yeah, it's ruthless. It's like, people could get seriously injured and all this different stuff. And with the rules they had there, I mean, I guess you could definitely have gotten pretty badly injured, but people knew what they were doing going into it.
Right.
But yeah, over time they kept changing the rules. I mean, they only had 2 rules. No eye gouging and no biting.
That's crazy.
I mean, biting I get. Why no eye gouging?
Like groin strikes?
They had groin strikes.
That's wild.
Yeah.
$50,000. And just like that, the UFC was born. The first UFC event ended up doing an impressive 86,000 pay-per-view buys. But the production quality wasn't very good, and many people couldn't believe the extreme violence. The New York Times published an article titled, "Death is Cheap. Maybe it's just $14.95. And Senator John McCain called it human cockfighting and attempted to get the UFC banned in all 50 states. So even with strong consumer demand, the risks were mounting. Art Davie famously told ESPN, "I don't think the New York Times is going away. I don't think John McCain is going away. I said, I wouldn't be surprised if President Bill Clinton comes out against this. I mean, it's possible." And it only got worse. By UFC 12, as many as 36 states had banned the UFC from holding events in their states, and they had even stopped allowing customers to buy them on pay-per-view. This meant that the sport needed to get cleaned up. But even after spending years adding additional rules, weight classes, time limits, and judges, boxing commissions and politicians still weren't very happy. So Rorion Gracie and Art Davie made the difficult decision to sell their equity in the UFC to Bob Marovitz, the president and CEO of Semaphore Entertainment Group. But that didn't last long either. Bob Marovitz ran the UFC for another couple of years, but he was losing millions of dollars, spending a ton of time in court, and the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. This is where Dana White comes in.
I don't understand why everybody was so against it, though. I mean, I remember everyone being against it because I was, watching it a lot those days. I don't understand why every state banned it and why it was so everyone was so against it. These people volunteered to fight. It wasn't like people forced people to fight or anything.
Yeah.
They knew what they were getting into. At this point, they already had enough rules to where they saw no one was getting crucially injured. Like there wasn't people getting really badly injured.
Yeah.
And like I said, they already had more rules. So I don't get it. But
so it's crazy right now. Dana White just is opening his second promotion ever. So UFC's one. The second is slap.
Yeah.
It's like the slap competition.
Yeah.
And people are saying the exact same thing that they said back then. Like, this is brutal, this is horrible, there's no skill, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Let's see if that one turns the same result.
That's how everything starts off. Everything that started off, no matter what it was, people are like, oh, this is crazy, this ain't gonna work, is it? But then eventually it does. People just don't know what they don't know. Some people have really good innovations and can see the future. But what's crazy is that it's sold from one person to another, and then it was still losing a couple $1 million. Forget about spending $2 million on it. Whatever, no big deal. That's the most you could lose, right? But to keep losing millions of dollars every year,
that's wild.
Where's that going to end? So for someone to buy it, knowing that it's losing millions of dollars a year, that's very risky. Let's see how in the world did they turn that around.
In Las Vegas in the late 1990s, and after spending a few years as a boxing trainer, he started managing UFC fighters like Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell. The fighters weren't making much money with the UFC, and neither was Dana, but this led to a conversation that would change his life forever. Dana was negotiating a deal for one of his fighters with the UFC when Bob Marovitz frustratingly said, "There is no more money. I don't even know if I have enough money to put on one more event." So Dana sensed an opportunity and called his friends, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta, who were co-founders of a Las Vegas casino business called Station Casinos. They talked through the details, spent a few months negotiating, and eventually purchased the UFC for $2 million in January 2001. Dana White was then named president of the company and received an equity stake. But still, from 2001 to 2004, things didn't exactly go as planned. The UFC was able to convince state commissions in New Jersey and Nevada to legalize the sport, and they had a few thousand people showing up at each event. but the company lost more than $44 million in just 3 years.
Holy crap. Going from losing a couple million a year to 44 million? That's a shit ton of money.
That's wild.
Damn, I lost that much money. I wonder how the breakdown of all that money and how like at this point they must be like, holy shit, like we fucked up.
Yeah.
Let's see how does this shit turn around.
And in 2004, Lorenzo Fertitta was tired of continuously writing checks and asked Dana White to see how much they could sell the UFC for. It became a very emotional issue for me. It was something that I dearly loved, being involved in the fight game and the UFC. But we kept having these funding requests, and there was no end in sight, Fertitta told the Las Vegas Sun. But Dana White was only able to find an offer that guaranteed them a multi-million-dollar loss. So the Fertitta brothers decided to keep going and try one last idea. In late 2004, Dana White and the Fertittas invested $10 million to create a show called The Ultimate Fighter. It was a reality TV show about 16 fighters who were split into 2 teams and coached by UFC fighters. They lived together, trained together, and fought each other for a UFC contract. But while shows like Formula One's Drive to Survive are immensely popular today, this was a relatively new concept in 2004, and the UFC was still seen as a risk to TV producers. So all the big broadcasters, including NBC, ABC, CBS, and ESPN, turned them down. And they were only able to find a home for the show on Spike TV after agreeing to give them the content for free and pay the $10 million in production costs themselves. That ended up being a smart move though, because while they didn't receive any upfront cash for the show, and $10 million was a lot of money to invest in a company that had already lost $44 million, The Ultimate Fighter ended up being a huge success. And it's the main reason that the UFC still exists today.
Yeah, I remember when they had that first Ultimate Fighter, and then they had Forrest Griffin fight, and man, it was just like the best fight. Like that was the best finale. Like they put the UFC on the map, and that fight was so bloody, but it was so good, and those guys were so happy after win. That was like fight of the decade, and it's still people talk about that fight through today. Man, Forrest fought. He died like last year.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I remember after that, like the UFC just started blowing up.
Yeah.
That was a crazy risk though. Spent $10 million on this when I started losing so much. I mean, I don't know how they thought of this or who came up with the idea or how it worked, but man, it really worked.
Dana White, I don't know if he mentions it here, but I've heard Dana White say this in interviews. He was like, this was our last ditch effort. Like if this didn't work, that's it. Like we're cutting the loss, whatever it is, it is. This was the last attempt. And he's like, and it worked out. Like it just ended up playing out and it had the most exciting like show ever.
Yeah, luckily.
For example, the first season of The Ultimate Fighter had 0 advertising, but the final fight between Forrest Griffin and Stefan Bonner.
Stefan Bonner.
Yeah, Stefan Bonner, he was so fun to watch. I mean, Forrest Griffin, I mean, they just went at it. They didn't, Can't believe Stefan Bonner died. That was...
Peaking at 10 million viewers, which was significantly more than Spike TV expected, and it even outdrew the Masters that day on CBS. This led Spike TV to pick up the show for a second season, which they paid for this time around. But more importantly, it introduced the UFC to the world and kickstarted a multi-decade period of growth. The UFC saw its annual revenue go from $14 million in 2004 to $180 million by 2006. This increase in revenue enabled them to start expanding, primarily through acquisition. The UFC spent the next 5 years strategically acquiring competitors like World Extreme Cage Fighting, the Pride Fighting Championship, International Fight League, Strikeforce, and others. This reduced their competition and enabled...
You know what? I hear a lot of stories about how the UFC started and how they lost all this money and then they finally, after the Ultimate Fighter. But I never hear about how much money did the WEC lose and Strikeforce. I mean, did they ever lose money or did they make money from the beginning? Like,
I wonder.
How did that start? I never hear stories about that.
Right, yeah.
I wonder how that happened. But obviously, UFC did so well that they were able to buy everybody out.
Right.
But that'd be kind of interesting to figure out, like, who started that. Like, why would you start that if they started it while the UFC was losing money? Like, why even, like, risk? I don't know. It's weird. So that'd be a cool story.
The UFC to add an entertaining mix of domestic and international stars to their roster, including Quinton Rampage Jackson, Mauricio Shogun Rua, Nick Diaz, Tyron Woodley, Daniel Cormier, and Ronda Rousey. Then, in 2011, the UFC signed a 7-year media rights deal with Fox Sports that was worth at least $100 million. The deal guaranteed them at least 4 UFC events each year would air on Fox networks in prime time, and it gave them a much bigger platform for their show, The Ultimate Fighter. But the deals didn't stop there. The UFC also signed a 6-year, $70 million deal that made Reebok their official apparel partner. Now, some of the fighters criticized this move because it disallowed them from selling their own individual sponsors on their fight kit. But
Man, I remember when they got that Reebok deal. Oh my God. Like every UFC fighter, I knew some, they were just complaining and being like, oh man, that's screwing us. Now we can't make our own money. Because before that Reebok deal, like they could get their own sponsors, they could do whatever they wanted. Right. That's how they made extra money. They didn't get paid that much.
Yeah.
But since the Reebok deal, like they got capped, they could only wear Reebok. And even when they got that, there was like a beer deal. Mm-hmm. I remember that you could only, sponsor that beer. And one of the stars, I don't remember who it was. I don't know if it was like Cormier or John Jones or someone like Rampage was like, fuck it. I know who it was. It was Brock Lesnar, I think. Mm-hmm. He said something about, I'm drinking my own beer or something. He got big trouble for it. Yeah, like people didn't like that they had to advertise with those people.
Dana White felt that it was imperative that the UFC cleaned up its look if they wanted to drastically increase the value of their next media rights deal. So fast forward a few years, and the UFC continued to grow. They were now putting on more than 500 fights each year. They had created legitimate superstars like Chuck Liddell, Brock Lesnar, Georges St. Pierre, and Anderson Silva. And the business was generating nearly $700 million in annual revenue. That made the UFC one of the fastest growing sports properties globally. And now that it was legalized in all 50 states, everyone wanted a piece of the business. So in 2016, the UFC was sold for $4 billion to WME IMG, which then became Endeavor. This was the largest sale in sports history at the time, and several other high-profile celebrities wrote checks to invest in the UFC, including Jimmy Kimmel, Sylvester Stallone, Mark Wahlberg, Ben Affleck, Rob Dyrdek, Robert Kraft, Cam Newton, Serena and Venus Williams, and Maria Sharapova. Now, a $4 billion sale was obviously an amazing outcome for a business that was acquired for just $2 million a little more than a decade prior. But rather than cash out and enjoy retirement, Dana White agreed to stay on as president of the UFC and continue to push the organization to new heights.
Dana was passionate about the sport and loved the sport and knew that he could take it to new levels. So again, like a lot of it was because he was making a lot of money he was doing it, but like he really enjoys it. You could tell like when you see him there how he's always happy, smiling, like he enjoys.
Yeah, he's relentless. Like I think that's like the thing is like he just knows not an answer. He's just gonna keep going. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, what would he do if he would have not been like? What would he be doing now if he wasn't involved in the UFC?
Yeah.
For example, after its deal ended with Fox Sports in 2018, the UFC signed a 5-year, $1.5 billion deal with ESPN. This placed 30 UFC Fight Night events on ESPN networks each year, and it guaranteed the UFC at least $300 million in annual income, or 15 times more than their previous media deal paid. Of course, this doesn't mean that everything has gone right for the UFC. Competitors like Bellator and PFL have started to attract and sign some legitimate fighters, like their homegrown star Kayla Harrison, as well as former UFC fighters like Anthony Pettis and Jeremy Stevens. And furthermore, the UFC is currently facing an active lawsuit from former fighters that claim the promotion is a monopoly, and they are consistently and publicly criticized for only paying about 16% of their annual revenue to fighters, compared to leagues like the NFL, NBA, and MLB, which all have unions and split revenue 50-50 with its players. But still, the UFC is an incredibly impressive business. Dana White and the Fertitta brothers acquired an asset that many people didn't think was valuable, and they nearly lost $50 million trying to build it. But less than 2 decades later, the company now does more than $1 billion in annual.
I mean, when they bought it, it really wasn't valuable. It was pretty much worthless. Right. It wasn't like they bought something and it ended up being worth something. They bought something and they did a whole bunch of stuff to it to make it worth something. Yeah. Like if they didn't do that Ultimate Fighter or they didn't do like a few things that they did, it might never have taken off. It might still be almost worthless. So they used, they tried a bunch of shit, probably a ton of stuff that didn't work, but the couple things that worked, that's what made it this $10 billion company.
Revenue. It's one of the fastest growing sports organizations globally, and each of them personally made hundreds of millions of dollars on the deal. So we'll see what happens from here, but I think the UFC is only going to get bigger.
So what's cool is, at the end, he's like, all right, I only think it's going to get bigger. So I remember, being really big fans of the UFC when, the stars were St. Pierre and Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, and all these guys, Anderson Silva. Yeah. And then at some point, St. Pierre quit fighting. Anderson Silva broke his leg. He was kind of washed up. Chuck Liddell kept getting knocked out. Tito Ortiz wasn't good anymore. And there was never really a great heavyweight. That I remember, Randy Couture, but he wasn't, he was cool, but he wasn't like, so, but those were like stars. And then I remember like when they all started retiring or not fighting as much, I was like, all right, who are the next people? John Jones came, and John Jones to me is probably the best fighter I've ever seen, like
Right.
pound for pound or whatever. But he fucked up his life doing stupid shit. But he's still, as an athlete, the guy is incredible. So, but after like all these fighters left, I was thinking, you know, who are the next fighters that's going to come? And there was a time period where I was like, you know, there weren't to me that many great fighters that were like as high of a pedestal as the, you know, St. Pierre's and Anderson Silva's and those guys. So I was thinking maybe when they bought it for that $4 billion or whatever it was, that it was going to start, you know, tanking. But there's always a star that comes up. Ronda Rousey came, then, you know, there's always somebody.
Conor McGregor.
Conor McGregor, yeah, Conor McGregor was a big one for him. So yeah, there's always someone that's gonna be the next big thing.
Yeah,
people need that next big thing.
And I think the bigger they get, the more they have. Like now, I feel like they have the more superstars than ever. Like people like Israel Adesanya, Francis Ngannou, like all these random people that just
Ngannou's gone.
Yeah, now he's gone.
Israel Adesanya's lost. Carl Usman just lost 2 in a row.
Right. But
I mean, it's crazy. Like because these guys were unbeatable for a while. John Jones is still the only unbeatable person.
Yeah.
Oh well, you had. What's his face that left? The 155, Khabib.
Yeah.
Khabib's unbeatable too.
Right.
But I mean, he just left so early.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if Francis Ngannou would ever fight John Jones. I don't know, because that would be the only.
The fight that's interesting. Yeah. To John Jones at least.
Yeah.
But what I was gonna say was one thing that he didn't mention in this video that Dana White says was the hardest thing his company ever had to deal with was COVID. He's like, now it sounds difficult that like I went from 44 million in debt to like making it $10 billion. He's like, I would do that 10 times over than have to deal with COVID. They were the first major sports leagues in the world to come back.
Yeah.
To come back like at all.
Yeah.
And they built this huge bubble, but a real bubble. Like NBA said they had a bubble, but it was like a 10% COVID rate.
Right.
He said 0.008 people got COVID.
Yeah.
Based off of their staff and their crews. They bought an island in Abu Dhabi called Fight Island to create it. Their numbers quadrupled in the year of 2020.
It was the only thing to watch.
Sports to watch.
It's the only thing to watch. Nobody wanted to watch replays. They wanted to watch live shit.
Yeah. Like Dana, like obviously there's a lot of like controversy with Dana White, like personally, and even like the way he pays fighters. But like as a person that's like, I'm not gonna take no as an answer. I don't give a fuck what government tells me what. Like he was the only person in the world to make it happen. Like that's wild.
Yeah. So you know we talk about it all the time. Problem solutions. The problem was figure out the solution. Go to a place that's gonna let you. I mean, there's always a place that's gonna let you. It's just a matter of how much will it cost and how long. You know how profitable can you make on it. But yeah, there's always a way.
Yeah, he's. I mean, I think most people say that like without Dana White, UFC doesn't exist. Like he was like a driving force. Obviously the Fertitta brothers, because without their funding, he wouldn't have been able to do it. But they bet in him. They didn't bet in the UFC. They bet on Dana White, and they were right. All right, so if you guys like this video, like, subscribe, comment down below, and make sure to hit that notification bell so you guys don't miss any more videos like this one.